All right, so let's start. I would like to welcome everybody who has joined us today for our presentation. We have the honor to host our, I think it's the third presentation in our DiKopA lecture series. And today we have Aris Politopoulos with us. And I want to give a very short introduction in who he is and what he does. Aris is an assistant professor at the University of Leiden, and basically he has like two main research foci. The first one is being an archaeologist of West Asia, and the second one is video games. And for me, this is the perfect combination of our profession, and I also will tell us all about it in a minute. So in the archaeology of West Asia, Aris has achieved a PhD not long ago about the creation of Assyrian imperial cities, a book that is still on my to-do list on my shelf, on my virtual shelf. But he is now focused on the representation of cultures of West Asia in popular media. And this is something that we have actually in common. So I do slightly the same as Aris does. And on the other side, so this was the archaeology side, on the other side, the video games, Aris is studying not only contemporary video games like the games that we are hearing about now, but also ancient games and play and the science behind that. He's a co-founder of the Value Foundation, a Leiden-based organization that is focused on research on the crossroads of gaming and academia. And I'm sure some of you have already heard about that. He is also co-running the Past at Play Lab project. And if you have seen the videos, they have a room full of board games that you really get jealous. This really looks good. And he's also streaming video games on Twitch for a long time now, I guess. He's not only alone with that, but he's also doing a big part on this streaming service. Today, Aris will talk to us about video games at the crossroads with academia and how we can utilize video games in a classroom and use this for teaching. And we are very excited to have you, Aris. I would hand the word over to you, and please start.
Thank you very much for this very kind introduction. This should work. I think everybody should be able to see my screen. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me as well. Indeed, I'm going to be talking today about video games and learning, and how we can utilize video games in different types of educational settings, mainly focusing on the classroom, but also talking a little bit about informal education and outside of the classroom. So one thing that is important to acknowledge, and I think everybody acknowledges it at this point, is that we are at a very transitioning point when it comes to digital education. Not only the catalyst, of course, was the COVID-19 pandemic, when we all had to transition to some form of digital education or digital learning, or online education, or online teaching, or e-learning. People have been coming up with all sorts of different names for the kind of stuff that we're doing. But one thing that is important to understand is that in many ways, we are the same people, so we are the same teachers, and we just need to learn how to utilize different digital tools. And how can these digital tools help us make better classes, help people learn in a more effective way. So there has been a lot of literature already when it comes to this transition, either with the COVID-19 pandemic as a catalyst, or in general, how institutions have been transitioning into a more digital or virtual learning environment, whatever one wants to call it. Now, one of the main things that I will be asking today, and I will be talking about today, is whether we can use video games to teach about the past. This is my interest. This is my main focus. How can we optimally use video games to teach about the past? And I think there are many different ways to do this, and we'll explore some of them. But I also want to clarify what this talk is not about today. And this talk is not about gamification. I'm happy to talk about gamification and my opinions about it at the discussion. But gamification is a very particular take on approaching the classroom, and it doesn't necessarily have to do with video games. It's just introducing gamified elements to the learning process, which can be effective, of course, but it can also be slightly problematic. So it's a whole different presentation, which I'm happy to talk about again, but this is not what we're going to be talking about today. So if you were here for gamification, I'm sorry. But what we are going to be talking about is, in essence, I think this image sort of captures what I'm interested in, right? I'm interested in what video games can offer in terms of experience. This is a picture taken from the Culture Arcade, an exhibition we did some years ago. I'm going to briefly talk about it a bit later in the talk. But what I'm interested in is this excitement and this immersion that games offer, and how we can utilize this powerful interaction, because video games are essentially interactive. So how can we use this powerful interaction in the classroom to make effective teaching? Now, this talk is informed by a very basic philosophical understanding, basic not in terms of how widely it is known, but it really forms the basis of my approach. And it comes from Ian Bogost's Play Anything book, where he quite literally argues that we can make play out of anything. And in that book, he argues for two things, among others. He argues that playgrounds, a playground is anything with boundaries and content that is experienced as fun, or can be experienced as fun. And then what does he mean by fun? Fun is any activity that is related to, with commitment, attention, and care. Having these two definitions in mind, it's very easy to argue that video games are, of course, digital playgrounds, right? They are bounded within their virtual space. They have content, and they can most definitely be experienced as fun. We commit to them. We are very attentive to our gameplay usually, and we care about the stuff that we do in them. So this is the easy part. But then I would argue that education, in the same way, is also very much a playground, or can be seen as a playground. Education is usually an enclosed place. Classes, especially when we're talking about the classroom, right, usually takes place within four walls. So it's very much an enclosed place. But even if we think about it more openly, education tends to happen within closed or confined settings, whether that is outside or inside. And in those places, the world is discovered and engaged with through a set of structures and rules, which is also very similar to how games are made. They tend to have structures and rules. And these rules are taken seriously, much like in games, you need to take the rules seriously, but they are also meant to be enjoyed by everybody. So in principle, education is meant to be enjoyed by everyone. So in that sense, I think education can very much be a playground. And also, because I'm an archaeologist, I would also like to make the argument that archaeology is also very much a playground. I think the easiest analogy to make here is a trench, right? I would argue that if you put an archaeologist in an excavation trench, you basically put them in a playground, in the same way that you can put any kid in a sandbox and they will start digging around and having fun. I think we're doing very much the same. We are in an enclosed space, whether that is the confines of a trench, or our offices, or our universities, or our museums. And in those enclosed places, we discover and engage with the past through set structures and rules, through methods and science, which are both serious, of course, but they're also fun, because again, and I can back this up with data as well, most archaeologists tend to find excavation a fun place to be. So then we actually have playgrounds quite literally everywhere. This is a discussion that has been going on for a very long time, from housing as Homo ludens all the way to bogus play anything. And if we make a cheesy Venn diagram of archaeology, video games, and education, I would argue that the place where these three things meet, I will very scientifically call it the sweet spot of super fun. And this sweet spot of super fun is what I'm interested in. So how archaeology, video games, and education converge, and how can we utilize this? Now, this intersection between the past and play is not something that is necessarily new. It's something that has been going on for some time, as I said, and I'm also based in Leiden, where Johann Huizinga wrote his famous book, Homo Ludens. And in that book, he argued that culture arises in play and as play. So he saw play as this foundational component on top of which human culture is built. He also talked about playgrounds in the form of magic circles, and he very much defined play as something happening. He argued that this is something that's happening outside of society within an enclosed space, a magic circle, and in that magic circle we have rules which we all agree on. It's voluntary, and we all get to experience fun moments within this magic circle. His concept of the magic circle has been widely criticized since then, and in many occasions rightfully so, but the essence of it, that play is central and foundational to culture, is something that people still agree on and build on top of. Now, his book Homo Ludens has basically, it has been the foundational book for the discipline that we know as game studies, and since then we've been talking about game history and platform studies, media archaeology, but also games and history, books like Gaming the Past by Jeremiah McCall or Digital Games as History by Adam Chapman. And a little bit more recently as well, we've been having this broad field called archaeogaming, which is basically the connection between video games and archaeology. But I think before we move forward, it is important to justify why we're talking about video games. And besides the fact that I enjoy video games, and Sebastian enjoys video games, there must be a better reason than this, right? Maybe not, but there actually is. It's important to understand the impact that video games have in our society and the spread of video games in contemporary Western society, also non-Western society, if we look into the impact of games in Asia. On a global scale, video games are extremely big business. It is actually the biggest and fastest growing entertainment industry in the world, surpassing Hollywood, surpassing other type of streaming platforms. Video games are booming and they are growing much faster than anybody could predict. Actually, I've been following this data for now 6-7 years, and every year that there is a projection, so we have the projections here for 2024, 2025, and so on. So when we had the projections for 2021, the projection was actually much lower. It was about $180 billion, and the actual number ended up being 214. So it's not only that it's booming much more than we thought it would. At the same time, I would like to make the claim that quite literally everyone and their mother plays video games. These are data coming to us from the Entertainment Software Association. This is a US-based association that deals with the entertainment industry. In a way, you can argue that there's a bit of an agenda behind this, but it does quite extensive annual surveys on different types of media, focusing one of them on video games. And in this, you can see that contrary to lingering stereotypes that want video games to be primarily experienced and enjoyed by teenage boys in their mother's basement. The average age of a gamer is 33 years old. So that's me. I'll be 33 for another week or so. So I fit with the average video game player. But also the split between genders is quite even. In this particular one, we have 52% identifying as male and 48% identifying as female. These data are a bit elaborated on in the actual report to include other genders as well. But you can see that there is quite an even distribution between populations as well. And this type of data tend to mirror very well the data that we also see in Europe. And another thing that is very interesting to me is that video games tend to be perceived as a solitary activity, something you do by yourself in your house. But actually, most people say that they play video games with others, whether that is online or in person, right? So the vast majority of players also are building a community through this experience of playing. And that is important to understand. In this ocean that is video games, there are also a lot of video games that deal with the past. These are data from the popular video game platform Steam. Steam is an PC exclusive online platform through which you can download games. It's not subscription based like Netflix, but you need to buy the games to be able to download them. Excuse me. In this platform, players can give tags to games, and one of the popular tags is the tag historical. So we scraped, me and Angus, mainly Angus, scraped Steam for all the games that are tagged as historian and compared it to how many owners these games have. So you can see that we have hundreds, if not about 1,000 historical games right now present at Steam, maybe even a bit longer because it's been a couple of years since we did this scrape. And you can see that some of these historical games are also extremely popular. So stuff like Age of Empires, Assassin's Creed, Crusader Kings, some of the big blockbuster games are owned by several million people. Games like Civilization 5 or 6 are owned by upwards of 5 to 10 million people. So there are basically there are a lot of historical games, and there are a lot of people playing these historical games. But that is not necessarily enough in terms of the data, I would argue. Yes, there are video games are really big, and quite a lot of people play them, and quite a lot of people play quite a lot of historical games. But then what does that mean exactly, and what kind of impact can we see in terms of learning? So back in the beginning of the pandemic, we did, with the Value Foundation, we did a large online survey to almost 1,700 people. Basically, we went to forums and subreddits and social media groups of these historical games, so the subreddits of Civilization or Age of Empires or Assassin's Creed, and asked people to fill in a survey that dealt with the ideas that they get and the perception they get of the past through playing these games. And for the data that are of interest for us in this particular presentation, overwhelmingly, so about 96% of the people claimed that they thought that people learned something about the past when playing video games. And also, and I thought that was even more interesting, again, overwhelmingly about 91%, the participants said that they thought that playing a video game can potentially change a person's viewpoint on a historical event. So not only people learn about the past through playing video games, but the video games are powerful enough to change preconceived notions about history. And this is very interesting. And this is one of the reasons of why we need to be utilizing video games, because they have this power to make people learn and make people reconsider aspects of the past. So as I said, this presentation will be split in two. One is going to be focusing more on formal education, and one part is going to be focusing more on informal education. So first, we're going to talk about video games in the academic classroom, and so the formal education. And I've divided this in different methods of using video games in the classroom. So you can, as I said, use video games in the classroom, but there are different ways that you can approach this. I'm going to talk towards the end also about some of the pitfalls of these methods, but let's see them first. So one of the easiest things to consider is to think of video games as analogy or as a reference. These video games, so games like Civilization, right, that are strategy games that include tens of civilizations in them. Players can play with one specific civilization. They can build their own history in the way. They create a lot of patterns that which we can use as an analogy or as a reference to make a point. This is something I do quite a lot in my classes, actually. One example is a class called Early Cities. And in these early cities class, I teach about the formation of the first states, the formation of the first cities, definitions of civilization, social inequality, and that kind of jazz. So games like Civilization that talk about the process of building a civilization offer a very good locus for discussion. I can reference it and I can use it to talk about concepts. So, for example, why is a game called Civilization? We as archaeologists or historians tend to find the term civilization very difficult to define, very contested, very problematic. And yet we have a game like Civilization that has been played for quite literally billions of hours. Civilization 5 from 2010 until 2016 has been played for more than 1.2 billion hours. So immense playtime, right? And that game doesn't seem to have an issue with the term civilization. So what does that mean? And what does that mean for our discussion in the academic classroom? Is this discussion that we're having different from the popular perception of civilization or not? If we want to talk specifics, we have here the example of the Persian Empire, right? How is Persia represented in that particular game? What does it mean that Persia is exclusively represented by the Achaemenid Empire? And what does that mean for our understanding of Persia as a broader culture that spans much more, both before and after the Achaemenid Empire, right? And also, what does it mean that we see the Persians, for example, as very good with money? How is that? How did we end up with this type of perception? The same holds true for games like Age of Empires, which is maybe more known to people my age and before. But also, there are other aspects that we can use as a reference. So, for example, games like Assassin's Creed that tends to make a lot of digital reconstructions of historical places. So here we see Assassin's Creed Odyssey. And in Assassin's Creed Odyssey, at some point, what I did is I went to Delphi in Greece, took a bunch of pictures, and then I took the same pictures in the game to make a point basically about the level of detail and accuracy that the developers went into. So they don't offer only a space that we can throw, that we can use as a reference to talk about concepts, but quite literally talk about these specific places, right? So games like Assassin's Creed do offer these places that we can use in the classroom to talk about the experience of being at Delphi, how things would have looked like. If we are actually at Delphi, we don't see all these statues around us. We don't see all of the complete temples. But in a game like Assassin's Creed, we do. And it's not so much about how accurate it is. In a way, it is quite accurate, I can tell you. I would even go as far as to argue that Assassin's Creed Odyssey has the best reconstruction of classical Delphi and classical Athens that exists right now. I don't think any virtual reconstruction of these places comes even close to the level of detail and beauty that is in Assassin's Creed Odyssey, right? But by walking around there, we can talk about it as well. It can also give us snippets of experience that we otherwise wouldn't have. One of my favorite points when I was studying at the University of Athens was always because we would do classical Greek theater as part of our studies. And I always thought it was very interesting how there seemed to be kind of a beef between the tragic poets and the comedians, the comedic poets. And in the game, this is not a spoiler, you get this moment when you're invited to Pericles' party, you get this moment, this little snippet, this little vignette, where Euripides and Aristophanes, so a tragic poet and a comedian, are just having a little chat, and Sophocles, who was the teacher of tragic poetry, is scoffing Euripides for hanging out with someone as lowly as Aristophanes because he makes comedies. So this little snippet, basically this little vignette that there is no other way to experience outside of a game, outside of reconstruction, because these people are dead for 2,500 years, basically encapsulates in 30 seconds this whole point that in a classroom it would have taken you a full 2 hours to explain. So not only you get the spaces, but you also have the potential of getting these vignettes. And again, it doesn't hugely matter if these are 100% accurate or not. I would argue that even the stuff that we do are not 100% accurate, but it offers a jumping point for discussion. And you can do that not only with historical games, you can also do that with all sorts of different types of games. In this class about early cities, at some point I had a class about the concept of societal collapse, and talking about the late Bronze Age collapse, but also how we as archaeologists think about societal collapse and what kind of approaches there are. So to describe societal collapse, I used a lot of games like the Fallout series, for example, that are all about societal collapse. In this case, post-nuclear societal collapse. But it does have aspects that reflect very well the kind of theories that we have anyway. The breakdown of trade networks, for example, alternative ways of trading, what kind of material become more important all of a sudden in a society that we perceive as collapsed in a way, how spaces are being reused and reclaimed. So we would spend quite a bit of time talking about a game like Fallout and how archaeological theories of collapse are mirrored in this type of games. Now, another class that I'm co-teaching often is Introduction to Digital Archaeology. And in Introduction to Digital Archaeology, one of the stuff that we talk about quite a bit is this idea of video games as a simulation model. This is not something that I necessarily specialize on, but there are people out there like Sean Graham, who has written extensively on agent-based modeling and how we can use video game principles for agent-based modeling, or how we can incorporate agent-based modeling principles in video games to talk about, to develop models about the past. And in this particular case, he had talked about Romans who want to go up in the social ladder in Rome, and what are the chances that they would die. And there are plenty of games out there that do this type of modeling of the past. People like Rubio Campillo, who has made a game called Evolving Planet, which you can find online. All of these people have also written in some of our edited volumes, like the Interactive Past, so you can check out some of these chapters. But these are stuff that are coming out of archaeologists again, but modeling the past and modeling ideas about the past has happened also outside of archaeology or history. Stuff like evolution of trust, which is basically an explanation of game theory, as happened from economists as well. Now we've been teaching another class called the Past at Play course. This Past at Play course was part of our Past at Play lab project. So as part of this project, we said we are also going to develop a course that deals with this intersection between the past and video games. And this course was developed by a bunch of people, so the members of the Past at Play lab project, Angus Small, myself, and Professor Sibyl Lames, as well as our student assistants in the project, Lotte and Lenneke. And in this course, we do quite a number of things that have to do with this intersection between the past and present. But we also try to incorporate concepts of the more, let's say, the more recent past in it. So one of the classes that we teach is about how the past is intersectional, right? How we can talk about stuff like queer gaming, queer identities in the past and in the present, or through thinking about the present, about the past, talk about them in the present, and so on. And there are a lot of games that do that. We also have a lot of guest lecturers from people who have actually made these queer games that deal with topics about the past. A good example is this game called Herald by a company called Wishfire, where you basically play in a fictional West India company setting on a boat. You play this person of color that also has a queer identity, and you go through these historical conceptions of gender and race in West India company. But then it's in a fictional setting, so that kind of makes it easier to talk about some of this stuff. Another thing that we do in that particular course, but I also do it in other courses as well. So I also do that in my science communication course as well, where it's quite self-explanatory. I teach my students how to talk about archaeology to a wider audience. And in that, I use video games as mode of telling histories. So how can you write effective stories that are historically informed, that you can then give to a wider audience to play? To do that, I use a very easy to learn video game engine. Actually, it's an engine to make interactive narratives. Think about it as this sort of old-time, you choose your own adventure books, right? You're presented, you read a text, you're presented with a couple of options. You can jump to page 5 or you can jump to page 20. So you can do that, but then you can do that in a virtual environment, and you don't jump to a page, but you jump to the next passage. And on the right-hand side, you can see how these stories are unfolded in a way in a virtual setting. And in this particular case, we also do that. We do that in classes, we do that in workshops. We try to teach students by using this idea of video games can tell histories. We try to teach them how to effectively talk about their own research or their own ideas about the past through this type of non-linear story formats. You can have, if you go to this particular link, sourceoftime.com/games/Babylon, you can see one of these examples that was made by me and Angus for a workshop to illustrate to people how you can use Twine as an effective tool. So to sort of sum up this very broad overview of different ways, I identify 4 main aspects that you can, or 4 main parameters, or 4 main methods that you can use to talk about the past by using video games. You can use them as reference or analogy. You can use them to talk about the present by talking about the past. You can use them as modeling, and you can use them as ways to tell stories. And these different methods can be applied in different types of teaching. So if you want to talk about reference or analogy, you can talk about more general stuff about the past. You can talk about regional specific stuff, like with Assassin's Creed, or like with the Persian Empire in the case of a civilization, for example. Or you can talk about more theoretical concepts like collapse. When you're talking about the present past, usually you rely more on the theory aspect and general, again, perceptions of the past. When you're talking about modeling, it's more about, again, theory, but also digital archaeology and digital methods in archaeology. And when we're talking about history telling, again, it can be something focusing more on the regional aspect of things, the regional teaching of the past, the theoretical teaching of the past, or something, again, that's more applied, more digitally oriented. And that leads us to the second part of this talk, that is about informal education. So I think it is important to understand that video games can be very effective within the confines of the classroom, but they can also be very effective outside of the classroom, and for types of educational settings that we usually don't think about. So I will present one of the projects that we've done in the past with the Value Foundation, a project called Raw Minecraft, which in Dutch is a very good pun, if I may say so myself. It's Romanian, it's the Romans and Minecraft, so Raw Minecraft. And we did that back in 2017. We started this project, and initially the idea of this project, it was back then funded by the South Holland province as part of the effort to add the Roman limits in the Netherlands to the World Heritage List. So we thought, okay, how do we raise awareness about the Roman limits in the Netherlands? How do we make people aware of their own heritage? We want to take an interactive and playful and creative approach that will ask people to learn about it themselves in a way, right? We want people to directly engage with their local heritage and learn through playing without necessarily having us just giving them lectures or just talking to them all the time. That was the goal. And this was something that was aimed at pretty much everyone. We didn't aim this to kids. People often thought that this is a directly kids-related project, but it really wasn't. We were very open to anyone participating, and it actually worked. And the original form of Minecraft took place in 7 different locations in the South Holland province, having more than 2,000 participants overall. And since then, we did the same project in different provinces in the Netherlands, like in the Gelderland, in Limburg. But we also did other Minecraft projects for the Nineveh exhibition, for example, or for the Prince Claus Fund, and all sorts of different settings in which we could implement this. So what did we exactly do with Raw Minecraft? We said, okay, we're going to take a very popular game, the game of Minecraft, right? Because we didn't think it was useful for us to make something anew when there is already something out there, right? When there is already a popular video game that can be very creative. So that was Minecraft. So we took Minecraft, and then we also got a bunch of PCs. We wanted this to be a pop-up setting, a mobile setting that we could take from city to city, right? That people could engage with or sit down and just play. So this is what our equipment looked like, and I will get into how these events looked in a moment. But I just want to show you that this was a relatively easy setup, right? So we had 4 PCs and a laptop at the time, bunch of screens, bunch of peripherals. Basically, most of the money from the South Holland grant went to this particular equipment. And this is what it looks laid out. So this is just before we started an event. This is actually not in the South Holland. This is in a museum in Nijmegen. But this is what it looks like. So 3 PCs that people can sit and play. 1 laptop where one of us was sitting to do sort of the master building process. And 1 VR station with an Oculus Rift where people could go and see the stuff that were being reconstructed. A projector screen, a router for hosting, and a server with total costs of about 9,000 euros. So it's not the most affordable, but it's also not the most expensive setup that you can have. And it's also quite mobile. It fit basically in a average station wagon. We could fit everything and just take it to anywhere in the Netherlands. And after we had set this up a couple of times, the setup time usually would take about 20 to 30 minutes. So, okay, that's cool. But what did you build? So the goal was, as I said, to reconstruct parts of the limes in the Netherlands. So what we did is we took GIS data and historical maps from the time that the limes was constructed. We made grayscale maps out of them. And then once we had these grayscale maps, we imported them into a software called the World Painter. World Painter is a software that produces maps for the Java version of Minecraft. So this is what the Minecraft map would look like of the South Holland province. So this map, this is the actual Minecraft map, right? The actual map is 1:4. If we would make it 1:1, it was going to be ginormous, because in Minecraft you walk at the same pace that you normally walk. It would take forever for people to traverse it, basically. But then the sites, and you can see some of the sites is along the river, right? Some of these sites, we reconstructed them in the 1:1 scale. So in this scale down map, we had these 1:1 locations where Roman forts would have been. And these were Leiden, The Hague, Alphen aan den Rijn, Katwijk, and a bunch of other places across South Holland, where we know there were Roman forts. And the goal was that people would go in these places. So if we would be in Leiden, people would go to our version of Leiden in this map, and they would reconstruct the Roman fort of Leiden into a 1:1 scale. And this is what the locations looked like. They were completely empty, basically. Eventually, we realized this was not necessarily the best method. So for larger builds, so when we were doing it for Nijmegen, for example, where people had to build a giant Roman city, we started imprinting the terrain with outlines of buildings to make it easier for people to get a kickstart. And then we also said, here is a bunch of material that you can use as reference. We are not going to give you a lecture about this. We're not going to talk to you about it. It's your heritage. You live in Leiden. You live in The Hague. These are places. This is heritage from your own city. So how do you imagine this? So we produced these little booklets that had both archaeological information about how Roman forts in the Netherlands and in the Limes Germanicus in general would look like. So there were a few pages of archaeological and scientific information, and there were a few pages of creative reconstructions, from drawings to Lego to real life reconstructions of Roman forts. And we said, you're free to rebuild this in any way you want. It was kind of a hot seat situation, so people could go sit down for 20 or 30 minutes in one of the PCs, build something, and then the next person would go and build. And also, if somebody wanted, they could bring their own laptop, hook up in our own server, and build for the 6 hours of the event or the 8 hours of the event. And we actually had a lot of kids or adults who brought their own laptops and just sat there for like 4 odd hours or 5 odd hours, just building Roman forts, really. And this is what the events would look like. This is, I know I said usually we didn't have that many kids, but this was from an event specifically about schools for the National Archaeology Days in the Netherlands. But this is what it would look like in practice, right? So people just building there, some people sitting back, enjoying the building process, waiting for their turn to play. And me, in this case, I was doing the master building, so I would always sort of direct part of the construction to have something happening. And then Angus, in this case, he was just going around answering questions, discussing about how they're going about their building process and whatnot. Initially, we thought this would be, we did quite a bit of planning to have a structured, kind of a structured event. But very quickly we realized this is not the type of event, this is not the type of outreach that needs necessarily to be structured. So we sort of embraced the chaos of play, because people we weren't very strict on what people should build. We wouldn't go and say, hey, you gotta build a barracks now. Like, you can't build anything else. You gotta build a barracks, right? And that ended up creating a lot of chaotic situation, a lot of play, a lot of construction, but also a lot of counterplay and a lot of distraction as well. In a way, we had to rethink, to reposition ourselves as scholars, because we are there and people would see us as people with expertise, but because we were not doing these lectures, we weren't sitting like on a pedestal, so to speak. We had the situation where, some people just knew Minecraft better than us, especially kids knew Minecraft better than us. So sometimes we said, what if you build this? And someone would show up and say, hey, it's better if you do it this way, actually. So this also allowed us to rethink our roles as scholars, but also rethink these type of reconstructions. Maybe we're not thinking of reconstructions the right way. Maybe somebody with a lot of imagination remade the barracks in a way that makes more sense than what we initially would have thought. This ended up again in a lot of chaotic situation. There were a bunch of kids, for example, that really wanted to make a roller coaster. They thought Roman forts would be much more fun with roller coasters. Generally, we tried to move people and say, hey, if you want to build, you're free to build whatever you want. If you want to build a roller coaster, build it outside of the fort, and inside of the fort, you build the Roman stuff. So people were free to build whatever they wanted outside of the forts, and the Roman forts inside of them. But once these kids built this roller coaster, then they went back into the fort and they actually reconstructed half of the fort by themselves, right? So by allowing them this open space to make the thing that they want, they also got inspired to get back and do the thing that was sort of asked of them in a way. We also had another kid that was very fond of polar bears. And even though it was one of our biggest fans, he would come on all the events. He also had a passion for polar bears. So this is in Leiden at Fort Matilo. And I've never seen a polar bear walking around in the Netherlands. But our fort had a polar bear infestation at some point. And we were, in a way, it was funny and quirky, and of course, not historically correct. But we had this moment of learning for this kid who was willing to understand, and he did understand that, polar bears don't exist in the Netherlands, but I wish they would. So I want to imagine this with polar bears. He didn't have a wrong perception of Roman forts in the Netherlands, but he was allowed to explore his imagination as well. And in the end, despite the roller coasters and the polar bears, we ended up with very, very nice reconstructions. And this again is Fort Matilo in Leiden. And Fort Matilo is actually not excavated, so we don't know what it looks like. We have some reconstructed towers of it. So this is a virtual reconstruction that people can visit. It's 1-to-1 scale, so people who would put the VR headset, they could walk around, right? So out of this chaotic play and out of this recentering of scholarship, we were able to produce a lot of nice reconstructions. As I said earlier, we've done a bunch of other things as well, focusing on this type of more informal education. So we've done the Culture Arcade exhibition. This is something that happened in 2018. And the idea was that we wanted to have an interactive exhibition. We worked with the Prince Claus Fund because they offered us their gallery, and we set up an exhibition there for free. So there was no ticket to enter the exhibition. Basically, we wanted games that would showcase the diversity of contemporary culture and heritage. So we asked people from all over the world, indigenous people of the Alaska, indigenous people of Mexico, from India, from Africa, from Australia, to send us their games. If they have made games that are related to their culture, send us their games and we will exhibit them in our exhibition. So we had games from every continent in the world. We had about 18 games that people could come in and play and learn something about that respective culture. We also did a lot of this type of Minecraft workshops similar to the Minecraft. We also did a lot of the Twine workshops that I talked about earlier in the formal education part. So there's a lot of potential basically for informal education through games. And also finally, when it comes to this type of informal education, Sebastian already said we've been streaming for a long time. So me and other colleagues from the Value Foundation, we are playing games in this popular streaming platform called Twitch. If you're a gamer, no likelihood you know Twitch. So we sit there, we play games for hours, and we offer historical and archaeological commentary over them. We even had a fully funded one-year project called Streaming the Past from the NWA, the Dutch national funding body, that awarded us a grant for 1 year to hire students and ask them to do that. So we hired 3 student assistants and they were streaming every week, 3-4 hours a week, some particular game and offering historical or archaeological commentary over it. And this was quite successful, all things considered. Of course, this is not the kind of thing that would bring you the thousands of viewers that your big Twitch channels have, but it is, we have proof that this is an effective method in a way. So to conclude, because I've been talking for quite some time, I would like to leave you with this idea that we can play with the past and we are playing with the past, and that through play, we know the world. It's this idea by Brian Sharon Smith, who said forms of play are transformation of modes by which we know the world. Playing with the past is something that's very popular. People want to play with the past. And at the same time, the past itself provokes play. It opens up this playful space, this playground that allows us to think about the past. But at the same time, our digital playgrounds tend to be bounded by our own histories, by the stuff that we know. But they also open up this space of reinterpretation, imagination, and rethinking. I would argue that video games can and they should be used in education. And oftentimes, one of the things that I've seen from colleagues is they come to me to say, hey, what if I add in my project like the creation of a video game? What if we make our own video game? Which, sure, if you can and you have the means and the capacity, absolutely. And I would also love to make my own video game. But at the same time, there is so much out there already that there is no real need to reinvent the wheel. We can use existing video games. People know them. Students know them. Mostly students would know them. So we can use them. It is hard. I'm not going to say that using video games in the classroom is easy. If you're not familiar with games, if you are not a gamer, if you never had an experience with video games, it's a pretty vast world that is relatively hard to get into. And it's also, like social media, the type of world that requires a lot of constant attention. Things change very quickly. Things become relevant or irrelevant very quickly. So I know that this is something that can be hard, but it can also be very rewarding. I think making games at the same time, stuff like Twine and history making, is an excellent exercise in rethinking about the past or in rethinking the past. And even if you are not a gamer, using this type of like Twine and other platforms that are easy to learn to make this type of histories and this type of historical games in a way, it's an excellent tool for the classroom to ask students to rethink their own topics, their own thesis topics, the topic of the class, and so on. But also for the informal education part, video games are a medium that introduces a wider audience to the past, and that is also something we should be keeping in mind. I've now, for the past couple of years, I've been asking my students in every class to tell me why they decided to become archaeologists and which mediums influence them the most. And the vast majority of them says that, yeah, I was playing Assassin's Creed, I was playing Civilization, and I wanted to become an archaeologist, right? So in my last seminar, out of 20 students, 15 said that it was video games, the primary medium that influenced their choice. And that was a seminar about the late Bronze Age in the Near East, so nothing particularly relevant to games. Next week, we have a conference, the Interactive Pasts Conference 3, happening in Leiden, but it will also be streamed for free on our Twitch platform, and it will also be available later on as VODs on YouTube. And there we have video game developers, we have historians, archaeologists, what have you, basically. We have a game dev panel, we have a game exhibition, all sorts of stuff. And we're very excited for it. So if you would like to tune in, or if you are around in the Netherlands, you're more than welcome. But if you would like to tune in on our Twitch channel, you're also more than welcome to do so. And with that, I would like to leave you. These are all our social media related stuff, past at play, value, or otherwise. So make sure to check that out. Thank you.
Thank you, Aris. That was wonderful. Let me clap my virtual hands, as I'm sure everybody does. Would you maybe stop sharing your screen so we can see ourselves? So I've found that very interesting and very inspiring. And again, as I said in introduction, we have a lot in common. And now I know we have even more in common. And I think you will find what I have to say next week in Copenhagen also interesting. One thing that I found very interesting in your talk was, of course, the project Raw Minecraft that you have done in the Netherlands. Could you imagine doing this also elsewhere, for example, in cooperation with students from West Asia? Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things we've done already is we've done a collaboration with Wales. There was this contemporary heritage site of coal mines, and there was this group that was interested in preserving local heritage of coal mines. And so what we did, we couldn't go to Wales because it was during COVID, but they sent us all their data. We remade these maps of that coal mine area, and then we send it back, and the kids would meet every Saturday for 4 or 5 months. And eventually they made this, it's called Mine Ronda, if you ever wanna look it up. They made this insane reconstruction, like one-to-one reconstruction of these coal mines, the coal mine houses, like underground. It was beautiful. So we've already done it internationally in a way, and now we're also trying to set up a collaboration with some colleagues in Morocco to rebuild parts of the city of Saleh, close to Rabat. So I would absolutely love to set this up with colleagues from West Asia. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's. I think this is a very great method to activate younger people to talk about their own heritage, right? So I absolutely love that. So I prematurely started already with the first question, but of course the floor is open for everyone to ask questions. If you want to ask something, please raise your hand and you will get the word. But until then, I have a lot of questions here on my paper. The second most interesting thing for me was that the example that you brought with the ice bear, right? With the polar bear. Yeah. I mean, you told that the kid, of course, liked polar bears, and therefore he included it in the game. So you had the opportunity to tell him about Roman times, polar bears, the location of Leiden, and that this not necessarily comes together. And this kind of brings me to the point that we often teach by letting students do mistakes and letting them figure it out, right? I think this is a very good method of teaching, actually, to let people do what they want and then say, okay, look, do you think polar bears make sense in Roman Leiden or not? I think this is a very good point to do, actually. Yeah, we had this a lot, and we had it also in
we had a kid at some point. He was sort of some kind of coding genius, and he was making. He kept saying, "You guys don't know how to play Minecraft," and we're like, "Well, clearly, yes, sure." But so what he wanted to do is he wanted to install all this. There is a console block in Minecraft, right? So you can open up a console and start recoding your server in the game. So he made all the ship of the fort color changing. So we had the rainbow ship that they would shift colors and all sorts of stuff. And suddenly all sorts of stuff started happening. And so I had this conversation with this kid of, okay, you do understand that color changing ship are not real. So why are you so interested in making those? And he said, well, I think it's fun and I like to code. So I don't care if it's historically correct. And then we had a long discussion about coding and learning about coding. So in the end, did he learn much about the past? I don't know, maybe not. And in a way, for us, it didn't matter. Not in the. We hope people learn stuff from it, but we also wanted to have which is not necessarily something you can do at the university, but we wanted people to choose if they wanted to learn or not. And if that kid wanted to learn about coding and wanted to display his coding skills in that setting, then that was also fine. Because then that does this recentering of all of a sudden the kid is the expert because I don't know how to do this type of coding in the game. So I let him be the expert of the thing that he chooses, and that is empowering.
It's empowering and it's kind of mirrors academic work, right? You work interdisciplinary with experts from other fields and you learn from them. Of course, this was a kid that codes and make color changing sheets, but it doesn't matter. It was the same in a smaller scale.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So we have a question by Sven Günther.
Yes, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me very well.
Yeah.
Best greets from China. I can confirm on the one hand what you said about video games and access to antiquity is, as this is the first access of our students, usually, that they become interested in ancient civilizations, as our institute is called here. And so they then choose to study Egyptology, ancient Near Eastern studies, or classics eventually and hopefully. On the other hand, you touched on in the last two questions on a very important point. We are very much used in the Western world, so to say, to teach critically and to reflect critically, starting from these video games. However, these video games, as you have rightly described, transfer stereotypes, topoi, whatever kind of. How to do this in a setting where you have not the tradition of critical questioning, which is particularly true for some countries, especially in Asia. And this, of course, then relates to how to teach this in a joint classroom, as you just have proposed to teach with students from Western Asia or maybe even from Far East Asia. Then you have two totally different groups, two totally different frameworks where such video games are perceived in, and then probably also two different kind of education and learning. It's just a question out of it.
Thank you. Yeah, this is both a very good and a very difficult question. So in my experience, currently I do have a master student from China who wants to make a game about how people perceive archaeology, and I've been surprised at the level of at her critical approach, mainly because when I've been working with other students from Asia or from mostly students from Taiwan I've worked with, but it has always been a challenge indeed to say, okay, just I'm saying something, just don't believe the thing I say, just I want you to think about it. I don't have a master answer. To me, this is all about enabling experiences, and I think especially in China, where gaming is so giant, and that makes it interesting. So in China, gaming is booming. Everybody plays games. Games competitive. There's a lot of like culture around it, either as resistance. So there's a lot of resistance through gaming, and because a lot of games are banned, people can't play certain versions of games and so on. So this is one way of like trying to identify the games that are games of resistance in a way. But also, I think the experience of playing does enable critical thinking anyway. So when you have this playground setting where people can experiment, it's a very positivist, I understand, way of thinking about play, and that is very open to criticism. I would also criticize it myself, but I think there is some merit to saying games are an open space. So when I want to teach and I have a mixed classroom of students from the Netherlands, from Greece, from China, from Syria, from Italy, right? I have this group that's super diverse, but if I tell them, hey, let's play this game all together, what thing do you think differently, right? What do you think about it? And then all of a sudden we come up with these 7 different ideas of this particular game, and that playful experience creates the moment of saying, why are we thinking differently about this? So you don't ask them to be critical, you just ask them to be themselves, and then you try to converge these opinions and enable the criticism or the critical approach. That's what I usually try to do in these mixed classrooms, and we have a lot of them in Leiden as well. I don't know if it's the most effective method, but yeah.
Yes, I would also say that, I mean, you can learn from other cultures as well. So it's not only the one way that we teach how we think about the past, but we can also learn how they think about the past, and especially the conflict that arises from that can be helpful for both parties, I guess.
And there is also this merit of saying, so the thing that we wanted to do with the culture arcade was, okay, there are cultures that have expressed themselves through games. Let's open this up, right? So there are games that have been humongously successful. So a good example is Never Alone. It was a game by the Inupiaq, the Cook Inlet Tribal Council in Alaska. They made their oral history into a game, sold 4 or 5 million copies worldwide. Insane. Nobody has ever been able to copy this. But at the same time, there are a bunch of other games that talk about this stuff. So in the Culture Arcade, we had a game about favelas in Brazil and family relationships. There was this game about a kid with an abusive father, and the abusive father was portrayed in a game in the form of a fictional monster, right? When we had it there, most Western people who do not necessarily conceive this idea of the favela, because we have some ghettos if you're in Paris, but we don't have favelas in the same way that they have them in Brazil. They would feel extremely uncomfortable playing through that game. And that shows the power, right? So games can offer this different perspective, and then people from other cultures can also get a critical glimpse of an experience. Games like This War of Mine also comes to mind, that talks about, it's a game that's based on besieged cities in the late 20th, early 21st century. Siege of Sarajevo and Baghdad and whatnot. It's a game about playing a civilian in a besieged city. Also a very powerful game. Also very uncomfortable in many ways. So there is this potential there for getting different cultures to express themselves through a game and then talking about it in a meaningful way. Indigenous people from Canada have made games about the construction of pipelines that trespass or destroy their own cultural grounds or cemeteries. So there is so much out there to do and use, actually.
So, Mr. Günther, do you want to respond, or?
Yeah, if I can shortly, I totally agree on the one hand. On the other hand, there are, of course, very practical issues. I mean, my wife and I have organized quite some seminars between Germany and this institute here and other Chinese students. There's first the issue of the platform of communication. As you know, there is this idea of 2 cycles existing in China, and that means basically that many of the Western communication media are not available, and vice versa. Chinese communication media, just like WeChat or so, is not available or not widespread in the West. And this, of course, already builds practical barriers. And as far as I know, most of the games that are available internationally are to some extent available in China, but in a Chinese version. So, and there is, of course, some censorship. So we should not maybe be too idealistic in this. There is a barrier, and this barrier, I think, is very hard sometimes to bridge. And this is really something we should take into consideration. And it takes quite a long time to jump out of the framework when you have been educated for decades in a totally different frame. And that's, I think, something one must really carefully design when teaching such global class, so to say.
Okay, I think next was Marion.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Aris, for this wonderful talk. I learned a lot, and I think I'm gonna look for a new video game for myself. And I totally agree with the kids' assessment that Roman forts would have been way more fun if they had roller coasters. So that's
Yes.
they got spot on there. You mentioned that a lot of your students, you asked them why they chose to study archaeology, and that sort of video games got them excited about archaeology. So do you also ask them afterwards, like after the course, if they are satisfied? Is it like the video games, did they present archaeology to them in such a way that they are happy, that they say, oh yeah, this is exactly what I expected? Or do you even ask them about that? Or do you get the impression that that it prepares students well for this discipline? Because in my time it was Indiana Jones, and as we all know, study of archaeology is not running around through labyrinths and stealing artifacts. And I also never had a whip. So the impression that you have when you study archaeology afterwards is very different. So yeah, I would be interested. Do you have any experience with that? Will your students afterwards tell you, hey, yeah, this is really what I thought it would be?
Yeah, I get, so over the years, I've changed a little bit my approach to using video games in teaching, because initially, so when I started doing that, I don't know, back in 2015, 2016, I thought there is nothing cooler than video games, right? So everybody must think the same probably, because we're dealing with a bunch of 18, 19-year-olds and they probably all play games. So one of the first things I learned from feedback from students was that not everybody plays video games. And that makes it hard and tricky to teach with video games. So one thing that one needs to consider is, okay, yeah, I'm using video games to teach, but actually this needs to be embedded and explained very well within my reasoning and explanation in order to be successful. Because I got a lot of students in a couple of classes that were alienated because they thought, yeah, the civilization thing you're talking about, I have no idea. And I got some other students who were like all over the whole discussion, right? And they dominated the discussion because they were gamers. So that is a very fine line to tread in one way. But also I do get, now that I've nuanced it a bit, and I'm sure there's a lot of improvement still to be made, but there is a lot more nuance. I do get a lot more students who actually, come to me and say, hey, this makes sense, right? And they are not, at this point, I think all archaeology students who have our second year, third year, they are not going to think, oh yeah, I don't know, Uncharted and Nathan Drake, that's how archaeology is, right? Or Tomb Raider and Lara Croft, that's what archaeology is. On the contrary, I would say, and that makes for the more interesting discussions, is that just like with Indiana Jones, archaeology students will want to push back very hard on this because their friends are going to say, hey, you're like Indiana Jones, you're like, you dig dinosaurs, whatever like stupid stereotype is out there. And they will want to push back. And I think it's the harder thing is to make them appreciate or learn, okay, yes, we're not Indiana Jones, but there is something that in the concept of Indiana Jones has done for the discipline, and we need to study this and understand this. And the same holds true for video games. Yes, civilization doesn't portray the correct view of history. We can be pedantic about it and be like, yeah, well, actually the detail, like this is incorrect and this is incorrect and this is incorrect, so whatever. But that's also not the point. So the biggest challenge is to actually pull them back into an appreciation for the medium and an appreciation for studying the medium and understanding what it can offer, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Thank you. So we have Sarah.
Thank you. First of all, thank you to Aris for this really fascinating talk, which was particularly interesting to me because I may be one of the few people who do not really play video games and never really got into it, which is a never-ending argument with my husband, who very much loves it. But my question is actually kind of question both to you and to Sven Günther. So my own research is mainly into what one can or cannot call Romanization. And so my question would be, are there any video games out there that essentially see the Roman conquest critically and approach the idea of Roman expansionism from a more critical point of view? And then sort of like the other half of my question would be to Sven Günther, how would such a game, if it exists or even if it doesn't exist, be potentially approached in China, where obviously the idea of approaching imperialism, expansionism, colonialism in a critical way may not be very favorable. So yeah.
Yeah, this touches on a lot of my other interests as well, because as Sebastian said, I've studied the Assyrian Empire for my PhD. So I've done a lot of empire-related studies and perceptions of empire and how you reframe the narrative about empires, basically. So there are a bunch of games out there, I think, that might be of interest to you. There is a game called At the Gates, or John Suffers At the Gates. John Suffers is the developer, where basically you play one of these barbaric, so to speak, tribes outside of the borders of the Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire is crumbling. So you have to be, you are the other, and you have to sort of attack the empire, which is very fascinating. It didn't end up being the best game, but the approach to me was very interesting. And another thing that has nothing to do with the Roman Empire, but it has to do with reframing imperial narratives, is actually a board game, but there is a version of it that you can play online. It's called Spirit.
I am a fan of board games, so I'm much
Excellent.
more likely to play that.
Excellent. Then you should play Spirit Island. So Spirit Island is a game that pitches itself as reverse Catan, which I'm sure people know, or some people would know Catan, where in Spirit Island, there are colonialists who are coming to your island, and you're playing as one of the spirits of the island, and you try to kick them out. And they're coming in like overwhelming numbers, and you're trying as a spirit to help the indigenous people kick the colonialists out. I don't think that necessarily it's super successful in being a reverse Catan, because it still does stuff with territory. But it's very interesting. And so one of the things we do in the Past at Play class, we have a class that is about colonialism. And we ask students to play Catan, play Spirit Island, and then compare the experience of colonizing an island versus trying to fend off colonial forces from an island. So I think these two games would definitely be of interest to you. I think there's a lot of space in reframing imperial narratives. I can't remember now. There was a paper. if I remember the title, I will let you know. Somebody was playing Europa Universalis, which is this giant grand strategy game, super detailed, historical, and whatnot. And I think they would play with tribes from New Zealand, which are very small and not particularly powerful, in an attempt to decenter the game from Europe. And the argument was that in a game like Europa Universalis, even if you play with indigenous peoples, you're always bound to succeed with the means of imperialism or with the means of colonialism. So there's no way to thrive other than expansion. There's no way to thrive other than domination. We made a similar argument at some point in a paper about civilization, and I think there is a lot to explore there, how these games that argue that they talk about cultures from around the world eventually bottle down to, yeah, either you expand or you lose. There is no other narrative, and I think it's interesting to talk about this.
Yeah, if I shortly may add, we are working here very much with frames and framing theory, and basically this means if you are within the Western discourse frame, there's no problem to discuss and question the concept of empire or to be critical of colonialism, as long as it doesn't touch the Chinese sphere. That's basically the answer. So all is possible, decolonialization, post-colonialization, and so on, as long as this stays within the Western framework. And I think this is basically the issue here, which of course is then for our students, I can say, a kind of refuge and privilege to do this kind of critical thinking. And what they do and how do they transfer it, we can only hope that they do.
Again, a good example for learning through play, right? All right, do we have any further questions for Aris? If not, I would like to thank Aris for his time, for his presentation, and for answering all of our questions.
Thank you.
Yes, and I would like to just very, very briefly show you what we have planned for our next presentation, which is a German presentation from Professor Dr. Fabian Stroth, University of Freiburg, vom Kork-Modell zu AR-Projektionen dreidimensionale Medien in den Archäologien. He will talk about his project Marble, mixed and augmented reality in blended learning environments. The presentation will be also online on the 21st of June at 3 p.m. And as usual, you can register for the talk with Mario. Okay, so then I would like to thank everybody now for your participation and for your time, your questions, and your discussion. And we are looking very forward to seeing you next time here again. So have a wonderful day and see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Aris.